So I'm Dr. Barry Marshall, uh, well known to all physicians, I'm sure, but personal hero of mine. So today's September 18th over here in Boston and September 19th in Perth, Australia.
Yeah.
So I'm looking into the future, and the future is you, Dr. Marshall, as well as a significant part of medical history. I don't know if you want to just kind of give an intro to your own self and your own profession and so forth, or should I just start out with questions for you?
Well, I'll tell you, I was born in Western Australia in a gold mining town called Kalgoorlie. My father was kind of an engineer. My mother was a nurse. Up to about the age of about 7, I was educated in Perth in Catholic schools, boys' school, and went to University of Western Australia, where I did my internal medicine, graduating in 1974. And I just missed out on going to Vietnam. They had a lottery here and I didn't get included in it, but I was in the sort of National Guard thing here. And since then, I just went into internal medicine because I felt that it was very challenging and difficult. And I took a bit of an interest in microbiology and got interested in Campylobacters, and they were the hot bacteria at the time. And then met Dr. Warren, who'd seen these curved bacteria in the stomach on stomach biopsies that weren't mentioned in any of the textbooks. So we went off on down a rabbit hole, if you like, trying to figure out how these bacteria lived in the stomach. One thing led to another. And as we're going to go through this interview, you'll see, it was difficult for 10 years. Nobody believed it, that these bacteria could be there for a start, and then that they could be relevant to causing ulcers, which were thought to be caused by stress. It was just, it was known that they were caused by stress.
Absolutely.
Took 10 years before people really accepted it, and it took another 10 years before we had a great treatment for it. And then a few years later, Dr. Warren and I got the Nobel Prize for that discovery. We did a lot of other things on the way, so it wasn't, just that. And meantime, my wife's a psychologist and educator and an art degree, all kinds of things. She's probably smarter than me. She's smarter than me, I think. And we had 4 children at the time. I was doing this original work in the 80s. And I got recruited into the United States at the University of Virginia and was there for 10 years on faculty, etc. And then I've been back in Australia now for the last 20 years doing a lot of international stuff. So I'm presenting today from my studio at home because we have a lot of things like online stuff since we had to deal with COVID over the last 3 years, but everyone's back to normal now. Although there's still COVID flying around the place and plenty of colds during the winter, so I just got over something. But I'm in good form today, as you see, Liz. Not blinking. I had conjunctivitis. I had an international trip, so a bit chaotic today.
Well, that's an amazing story. There are actually some far more amazing parts of the story. We'll get to a little bit as we go on. As a personal note, I'm a little bit younger than you. I graduated medical school in 81 and high school in 73. And at the time, we also had Vietnam. And I was actually, I was on the lottery as well for being drafted. I got a good number and was not. We were kind of at the tail end of that. So we share that in common, but probably a little bit on either side. But mine was the less dangerous side as things were tailing down. But you're on a other personal note. I wish you'd been around just a little bit earlier as well, because my grandfather suffered from peptic ulcers, and this was an ongoing thing when I was a kid. He was kind of force-fed this bland diet, and everything was white. White bread, macaroni and cheese, this and that and that. And he really rebelled against it on his own. He would eat things that were different. But it was all, and it was stress that gave him his ulcers. And so he had to, but he was a very, frankly, everyone calls me Little Dave. His name was David. And I apparently looked like him. And as time went on, I acted like him a little bit. So I'll stand in as his proxy. today
Yeah.
to wish that you'd been around a little bit earlier and free my former self from some of the kind of tyranny of small-mindedness in this sense, which was vastly unproven and I'm not sure necessarily ameliorative either. Had you had experience with people with peptic ulcers? Was that no pun intended, kind of a pain point for you or the members of your family?
Well, I knew people sort of around my family. You could go back 2 generations. One of my great-great-grandfathers had an ulcer, and he was in hospital with a bleeding ulcer, and the doctor had said, whatever you do, don't feed him anything acidic. And of course, after a week in hospital, he was craving for some fruit. And one of the visitors on the Sunday in the next bed in the ward brought some oranges in for that patient. And so my grandfather then stole one. My great-great-grandfather stole one apparently and ate it against medical advice. And then about 4 hours later, vomited. And I think he vomited and died from his ulcer, bleeding ulcer. So everyone says, yes, that acid in that orange caused it.
Well,
So,
that's
so
a
you
funny
hear
thing.
those stories.
That's a funny thing by itself. I've always, people have always talked about, the acid in your food, but when I was a chemistry major, and the acid in food is kind of pales against the acid that we actually produce
Okay.
by strength and so forth. Which actually, it's not one of my scripted questions, but I might as well ask you. I kind of see the stomach, the GI process, a little bit like a car wash. The first phase is getting in the car wash, but once you're in the stomach, there's kind of this clean out. And hydrochloric acid is, supposed to break down any, when we used to chew bones or shellfish or whatever, kind of break down the calcium and sterilize everything else, but including bacteria. So, most of your ulcers are duodenal or duodenal, depending on pronunciation. And when we say peptic ulcer, a little bit further on in the small intestine, how does this Helicobacter pylori, which has an interesting name by itself, how does it get past the first phase of the car wash, which is sterilizing?
So you're right on it there. I think the main reason you had the stomach, obviously, it produces acid, which destroys proteins and things in the stomach, but it sterilizes the food. And so in the stomach, the mucus layer is quite thick to protect the lining from the acid. So it's like like the slime on a fish, kind of waterproofs the lining of the stomach. So the acid's in the middle, and then it kills all the bacteria, because when the food goes then into the small intestine, there's no thick mucus layer there. There's a brush border on the epithelial cells that are absorptive. So they are trying to take all those little food particles and everything inside the cell. So in fact, the food becomes very, very intimately associated with the lining. If there's bacteria there, you can see that they could easily be invasive. So to cause any trouble, bacteria usually have to get through the stomach for some reason and then stick on the small intestine. That's where cholera and those horrible diseases happen. That's one point. The second issue is that when you eat, so that in evolution, as soon as there was a gut with a transit time, you see bacteria would be growing in there and taking all the value out of the food. And so that you didn't want that to happen. So sterilization is one of the main reasons mammals have had stomachs, for 350 million years since we were fish or insects or something. So that's the thing about the stomach. The other thing about the stomach that people don't realize is that it's usually empty. So it's like a wet paper bag there. And it's not like a football unless you've just had a big meal, so that it's got the two sides very close together. And if you swallow a bacteria like Helicobacter that's a bit attracted to the wall of the stomach, it'll stick in there it only has to go about 2 millimeters, and it's actually inside the stomach mucus, and then it's going to infect you. So that's why it infects everybody, I guess.
Fair enough. So let's talk about your journey. As a medical doctor myself, I was mostly in primary care for decades, and latterly I've been involved in writing and so forth. And I have been investigating the Zika microcephaly pandemic's disappearance.
Yeah.
And I've encountered a lot of skepticism when I challenge established scientific beliefs. What advice would you give to fellow researchers and physicians to stay resolute in their pursuit of well, I don't want to say about myself, but
Yeah.
potentially groundbreaking discoveries and so forth, when that go against the flow.
So the issue is you've got to get data which is irrefutable, and so people don't believe you or are always going to have a different reason why it might be happening, and why you might have got the wrong answer. So the initial thing in clinical research is a doctor makes an observation in a patient, I think, and maybe sees some association there and says, well, I wonder if this could be the cause. You've got, particularly if you've got no known cause for something. So ulcers and stress, you could find stress in everybody. So, it's a big cop out. Anything you don't understand caused by stress, everyone's got stress. You can never cure it. You're born like that or you grow up like that. That's it. And so why don't I give you a diagnosis that now doesn't say that I'm a bad doctor for not being able to cure you. It says that you're a bad patient for not changing your stress level or lifestyle or a diet is all those things that you can't do anything about, and we blame that, and also the hereditary part of it. So that's the situation that you're tackling in a lot of these diseases. The other thing to remember is that for most chronic diseases, there's already an industry built around the treatment of them. So with ulcers, obviously, the gastroenterologists do endoscopies, and people take acid blockers. So that was many billions of dollars there in that industry, and those people are not just going to roll over and just do something else. They've got a strategy and a plan and everything. So that's one of the things that I think it was in my Nobel lecture, but Dan Boorstin, the Librarian of Congress, used to say that the problem is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. People already think they've got the answer. We know the answer, therefore, why would you want to do research on this? So that was one of the things. So first you start off with a bit of clinical observation, and then say you're even in private practice, general practitioner, you say, gee, I wonder if this, say people are coming in with yellow. This is something I remember from years ago, yellow complexion, and you check it and it's not jaundice, they're going a bit yellow. And you take an interview, the patient says, oh, yeah, well, I've gone on this carrot juice diet, you see, so hang on a minute. So you find a few more people, and you find that there are people who aren't jaundiced, they're gone yellow, and they're taking carrot juice. So, okay. So then you could do an experiment where you stop the carrot juice, or you give the carrot juice, or whatever you might want to do. And then you can say, okay, it's caused by carrot juice. So you go through that process. So with the bacteria, first thing is Dr. Warren makes an observation that in the stomach he sees bacteria, and they're all the same. So they're not just swallowed bacteria from the mouth, which would be all different types. If you look at a gram stain in the mouth, gram positive, gram negative. So you would see like a mishmash of all kinds of different bacteria if it was from the mouth. But he said that, well, look, I can see these bacteria, they're all the same. And by the time I connected up with him, because I was looking for a research project in gastroenterology, and I went down and he showed me these. He spent the whole afternoon with me looking down the microscope. And I said, I knew nothing about the gastroenterology and not much about microbiology. So as an empty vessel, he could put his ideas straight in, and I'm accepting them. So I never thought it was possible these bacteria weren't there, or they weren't growing in the stomach, because they all looked the same. So they must have been multiplying in the stomach, and really you didn't really see any other bacteria in the stomach. So I was hooked. And the exciting thing was, for any young physician who might want to do some research, which is probably everybody, get a published paper. Hey, we can publish that there's bacteria in the stomach in some people, and they look like this. And we could try and culture them and see how they lived in the stomach when there's acid there. And all the medical textbooks would say, and anybody who knew anything about the stomach would say, acid kills bacteria below pH of 3. So how could it survive when you measure the pH in the stomach as pH 2 or 1.5? It's quite, as you said, quite acidic. So that was an exciting challenge, and I thought, well, I can study this a bit and write it up. But of course, you get a bit addicted to finding things out at that point. And the insight for Robin Warren was that he said, Barry, when you get the biopsy, don't take them from the ulcer, because that's something that's healing. And you'll see polymorphs, inflammation, everything. It'll be very confusing. And there's, pus and all kinds of stuff in ulcers. Take it away from the ulcer, 5 centimeters away. So I was sending him biopsies away from, if there was an ulcer there, we didn't biopsy it initially. We just biopsied the gastric mucosa. And then, so we then, after about 6 months, we were very frustrated. We couldn't grow the bacteria. And so he said, okay, well, let's just do 100 consecutive patients coming for endoscopy and see if we can figure out, why these bacteria are there. Do they have pets? Is it koala bears, kangaroos, or chickens, or travel? All those usual things about an infectious thing. And then, do they have any symptoms or anything wrong? Because we didn't have the association with ulcers at that point either. But so in that 100 series, it was blinded, so that I didn't know what the microbiology was doing, and I didn't know what the pathology was doing until we'd finished the 100, and I was just writing down the endoscopic findings. So in there we had people with ulcers, without ulcers, and then the material went to the special areas. And then after 6 months, I had all the data came back to me, and then I said, hang on a minute, all the people with duodenal ulcers have got this bacteria, and then the rest of them got inflammation. And the thing was that the idea that inflammation in the stomach was the cause of ulcers had been around for about 100 years. Why have people got gastritis? And maybe that's got something to do with ulcers, because everyone with ulcers has got gastritis. And it didn't, so that when Warren went and when we tried to run the statistics on that, we were using SPSS, which is the standard mainframe in the 80s, and it could just give a p-value of 5 zeros, because that's as far as it went. It didn't. It's okay. It's proven. So Warren went out then and bought an HP 11 calculator, one of the first nice little HP landscape calculators, and that could do 10 to the 64, which is the level of precision you needed to do a Fisher's test on our association with gastritis. And it was like 0.1001, some I can't remember exactly, but it's impossible that it was a fluke. So we had an association at that point, and we had a connection with duodenal ulcer, like an association that was stronger than with gastric ulcer. So I said, subsequently I said, well, let's search the literature with the literature search. Anyway, people had reported that everyone with duodenal ulcer had gastritis, which we had found. And so by the end of, a couple of years research, and we cultured the bacteria and things moved on from there. But at that point, so we definitely had something interesting going on that possibly could be related. So it was a very weird hypothesis. Maybe it's not stress. Maybe these bacteria somehow cause ulcers. How could that happen? And the ulcers aren't in the stomach, they're in the duodenum. So then, where are you going to go from that? And so that started about, 10 years of research, because there was a treatment for ulcers, which was acid blockers. So that to get the next step, you actually had to, okay, let's eradicate the bacteria and see if the ulcers are cured. And you could kind of, looking at the data that we had, you could say almost certainly it's impossible to get a duodenal ulcer if you don't have the bacteria. Therefore, if we take you with the bacteria and get rid of them, it'll be impossible to have an ulcer, so you should be cured, so that you could extrapolate. And it took me a couple of years to get funded. So the thing is, you go through several processes. You've got a hypothesis, you do a pilot study, then you say, okay, well, let's be a bit more scientific. Let's do a prospective study and measure a few things and ask people all the right questions. And then if that comes out, well, then let's do a prospective doubles-blind placebo-controlled study and get to the next step. and then it'll be publishable in something respectable. In fact, the first, so you start off with a letter or a poster somewhere in a conference, and you're this young person, you have no confidence, and people who are legendary will be at that conference, and one of them might walk past your poster and say, "That's pretty interesting. I never noticed that," or "I did. I've seen that before." You know, that kind of thing. So that's your poster, and you think, "Oh, geez, just a poster. That's pretty small fry." But in fact, if you're going to win the Nobel Prize, the committee that makes the call is going to drill right down until they get that poster, and they're going to say, who are the names on the poster? So that's what sets the names for the Nobel Prize. So you should have not more than 3, and it was just we had 2. And the other thing is, when you do that poster, it's unimportant. So you don't get every professor in the university trying to get their name on it because you worked in their lab. So we were obviously getting favors from, you know, people in the hospital, people in other labs, the statistician. But on the poster, we would have had, or our first letter to the Lancet, in fact, there was 2 names. And then if you look at subsequent papers, there's lots of names on them. Everybody pretty interested in it at that stage, but it was our discovery and our original work. I'll tell you a couple. So part of this discovery, and you can go through your questions carefully at this point, and you'll see that you know, you've got a pretty good sequence of events there. But I was more clinical. I was interested in how do you treat it. I discovered that bismuth, which is in Pepto-Bismol, kills the bacteria. So I got data from that, and I got a funding from Procter & Gamble, who makes Pepto-Bismol. Barry, come to the United States. We want to hear about this. So that got me going. And then the other one was, you know, how do you diagnose it? So I got some diagnostic tests, because people who believed it couldn't get enough support from their hospital or their pathologist or microbiologist who didn't believe it. So that people who wanted to do research on it couldn't really do it. So I invented the urease test, which meant that a gastroenterologist didn't need a lab anymore. He could do a urease test, stick it in his pocket. 20 minutes later, for $5, he'd have the diagnosis. So that kind of thing really, a few enabling technologies that I was connected with really made it very popular. So it sort of got a bit out of control after that in the US, and NIH got involved, and I think all those things just take off at that point. So I could have, I know I wouldn't have had enough money to retire at that point, but I could have quit, and it still would have happened after 1990. There were enough people interested in it, and we had double-blind data.
Yeah, that's amazing. Actually, I'm interested in that one part where Dr. Warren mentioned not culturing the ulcer itself. I'm reminded there's a World War II actual event where airplanes came back to the U.S. and British bases, the airplanes that survived, and they noticed that they had, you know, various bullet holes in the wings and this and that, and they're like, oh my God, we have to reinforce those parts. Have you heard this one?
No.
And so somebody, I don't know, some science statistics guy said, absolutely not. These are the planes that came back. These planes were able to survive those holes. You have to reinforce the places where you don't see holes, because those are the planes that that are sitting in the fields in Germany right now. Those are the places where you don't see bullet holes. Those are the non-survivors. These are the survivors. This shows the plane can survive those bullet holes right there. You need to reinforce the places where you don't see bullet holes. And everyone was like,
yes, that's logical.
Counterintuitive thinking.
Yeah,
that's really the genius right there.
I've got that audio book, Blackett's War. So Blackett was this a Nobel Prize winner in physics, came out of the British Navy, and then he was sort of in charge of the think tank for World War II, saying, okay, you've got to have 60 boats in a convoy. Don't just send them across the Atlantic. And a few other things that he recommended made a big difference to the Second World War. And one of them was things like that. And, you know, what do you set if you're flying and looking for submarines near the surface and they're diving, you know, what do you set the depth on your depth charges for? And should you be flying into the sun or away from it? You know, all that kind of stuff. It was just, so they had a lot of science eventually in the strategy against the Germans in World War II. Mm.
So again, slightly going off script here. You know, there was what originally was cimetidine as an acid reducer. Did you find any resistance, not just, you know, from your peers in the medical community, but did you find any resistance from the pharmacologic community? I don't know if they are a community, but that this is being treated well enough. We don't necessarily need this. We're handling the problem because, in a sense, you theoretically, I don't think it's panned out, but theoretically, you could have been bad for business.
So obviously, these companies are making money selling a drug which you can never stop, because when you stop taking the cimetidine, your ulcer came back. So the perfect thing is, you know, that's what supports pharmaceutical companies. It's, you know, acid blockers, because these days it's not H. pylori, it's not ulcers so much, it's reflux esophagitis in the baby boomers. We're all getting older, we're all getting it. So acid blockers are probably one of the #1 drugs in the world still. So these companies were then treating ulcers, and every year they'd be selling more of these acid blockers. And it became evident then that once you were on them, you could never stop them. So that obviously the stock price is related to how much money they're going to make over the next 20 years if you've got them in your retirement fund or something. So they didn't have any incentive to find out a cure. So this is something I realized very, very early on. Pharmaceutical companies don't make much money out of cures because you only take it once. They want you to have a drug. They want to make a drug that you take every day for the rest of your life. So then they sell you $10,000 worth of drug, not $100 worth of drug. So that there's a disincentive to chase the Helicobacter thing. And so there was very early on, there were individuals, smart individuals in the pharmaceutical companies says, Barry, this is a hot topic. We've got to tell the people in those days, it was Smith, Kline and French. They were based in not Boston, Philadelphia, you know, southern New Jersey. I forget where it's called, but so all the good pharmaceutical companies in the US more or less started off there, and So I got a little bit of funding to get a database and a computer and talk to them. But then they said, well, we don't really want to publicize this wacky idea. And there were notes circulated around in the company, just keep it quiet, just don't say anything about it. So as soon as you argue against it, you give it airtime, oxygen, as you might say in the publicity world. And so the best thing to do for the pharmaceutical companies is just pretend it's not there and don't comment on it. And so they could prevent the Helicobacter idea coming forward just by carrying on as they were doing, funding lots of research into the use of acid blockers. And so an ordinary doctor looking at the literature would say, well, I can see there's like 33 papers published this year, double-blind studies of acid blockers, and there's 2 papers in less reputable journals, you know, dodgy kind of studies, anecdotal reports happening about the Helicobacter. So obviously that would mean that only less than 5% of ulcers are Helicobacter and 95% of these acid problems. And so it stayed like that for several years. And so by just diluting the information about ulcer treatments to be mostly related to ulcers, and all those kind of funded studies were happening already in the 80s, so that it was 5 years before somebody could finish those studies and then change their research into Helicobacter. So you see that the first studies in the United States were sort of started to get published about 1990, And the people who did those immediately were converted into the bacterial future. And unfortunately, all the big institutions doing ulcer research were funded by the acid blocker people and NIH and different other ideas. And they had funding programs to discover the cause of ulcers. It was 5 years before their money ran out, and they switched over to Helicobacter. So that's why it's a little bit more conservative in the US. Or if you've got something that's going, they're not going to spend the money on doing something else halfway through the 5-year program. They're going to finish it. So they might have and the other thing is that because we were at the stage of Me Too drugs, like cure rate for, in quotes, cure for an acid blocker like cimetidine was like 85%. Most ulcers would heal. So if you came along with the next one, which was ranitidine, you would want to show that that's the same, so that you would need 250 or 300 people in each arm of a two-arm study. So you need 500 patients followed for a year to talk about healing and relapse, things like that, to show it's the same. So I have to hand it to the FDA. They were the ones that made people do proper research, and that's why clinical research in the US was really, it probably still is, leading as far as finding things out. But it meant that it's a bit harder for something new to make inroads, although not too bad. It requires hard work. And I say to people, if you can't get it accepted, you've got to do two things. You've got to work out what your hypothesis is, and then work out a test for the hypothesis. If there's no way you can test it, then how can you ever prove it or disprove it? So there you're going to go nowhere. So you may as well just keep thinking about it, reading the literature, and maybe go on to something else. So if you've got a testable hypothesis, you've got to test it. You've got to do the prospective double-blind study, and then things will start to happen. So that depends on university-based, NIH type of funding, maybe philanthropic funding. So that's the type of funding that you want. And then once you've got that data and a solid bit of proof, then things will start to accelerate after that. But it's a hard process.
So just on the landscape, I don't know if you followed the incidence of peptic ulcer and the current treatment and whatnot. I mean, I've treated a lot more reflux over the decades as time went on than actual duodenal peptic ulcer because of basically the cure. But a lot of people are on Prilosec, which I think is a better, more complete proton pump inhibitor medication, stopping acid completely. But there becomes this kind of addictive aspect where when people stop it, they get huge kind of rebound acidity. And I'm also wondering whether there's the ability better for bacteria to pass through and cause other problems as a result of kind of the complete acid blockade. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I'm wondering if you have any kind of big picture.
Yeah. So although the issue is if you have acid reflux, well, then it does give you a cancer risk in the esophagus. So there's good data on that. So people with acid reflux should take something so they're not getting heartburn all the time. But remember that if you get rid of the acid in the stomach, you still, excuse me. So I've got to make a call after this. You're still getting reflux. So maybe it's coming up your throat. Maybe it's making you cough at night or something. Potentially bacteria are getting down. You're not absorbing all your calcium and iron and things properly. So I prefer to take a H2 blocker. And I know that once a day at least your acid comes back for a little while and sterilizes your stomach, cleans it up. But H2 blockers are hard to find these days. So perhaps 20 milligrams of omeprazole will give you, half a day's of acid blockade and maybe get you over the symptom. I don't know whether that's proven to be a good strategy. So, but then you got our osteoporosis and a few things like that might be more frequent if you just take full acid blocker for 20 years or so. So you got to think about these things.
I agree. I actually personally, I've had horrible acid reflux And I've kind of come up with just occasional liquid antacid.
Okay.
People don't really do that or favor it very much. It's very inexpensive, and I don't want to just trade therapies here, but oftentimes I would recommend that for people to wean off their either H2 or their proton pump inhibitors. Just using intermittent antacid, because antacid, it's a pretty much acid-base equation. It works perfectly, and it's almost diagnostic for people having either one.
Yeah. So,
but,
you cannot reflux if the stomach's empty and you're vertical. So if you're sitting up, standing up all day,
right.
you don't need the acid blockade at that point. But in the evening, you have your meal, and just logical things like that, and you can take a PPI and an antacid tablet as needed. I think that's probably not a bad strategy.
Yeah, that's what I do. I pretty much do it HS.
Yeah.
So again, another maybe side note. I have a book in the works on cancer. I know there's 1,000 books on cancer, but this is my book on cancer. And one of the things I noticed incidentally when I was researching it is that the number one cause of cancer death in the United States in 1915, 1920 was gastric cancer, and we hardly see any of that. It's a little bit on theme. Are you aware of that disappearance, and do you know the rationale?
Yeah, so the Mayo Clinic was started by some surgeons, I think, and it was all gastric surgery in those days. It was gastric cancer. There's all kinds of things went on the Mayo Clinic related around the stomach. And gastric cancer was the most common cancer in the US, and then it declined after 1930, and that was probably because fresh fruit and vegetables and refrigeration. So people were getting more vitamin C. And there's a little bit of data that suggests that if you've got vitamin C in the stomach, it takes out the carcinogens. So if you've got acid and you've got a bit of vitamin C, then things you eat with carcinogenic compounds in them, whatever they might be, don't work. They're not carcinogens if vitamin C is around. So you want to protect yourself from stomach cancer, probably a small dose of vitamin C every day is probably not a bad idea.
I think also eating fewer rancid foods. A lot of the concept is that a good part of the kind of the tropical world, the heated countries, they have hot foods, they have hot spicy food, but a lot of times it's apparently to disguise the meat having gone bad because it's tropical. And once you have refrigerators, it just kind of coincides with the invention and distribution of the refrigerator that gastric cancer disappeared.
Yeah, that's true. And a lot of the studies on gastric cancer where they're trying to figure out the associations with it have been hard to do because they're definitely declining as the standard of living rises. And as you said, people have got refrigerators and fresh food year round. And but Helicobacter is the one thing. So there's a bit of data in animal models just shows that if you have Helicobacter, everything else is worse. So if you've got a little tiny bit of carcinogen and you've got Helicobacter, your cancer rate goes up through the roof. Or if you've got a genetic tendency towards it, it's like 14 times as much. For instance, if you've got one of these weak oncogenes running in your family. So anyway, that's lucky. It's good to find something that you can cure. So everyone likes to test for Helicobacter.
No, it's really an amazing thing. It's been great. So were there any pivotal moments or key experiments that provided the turning point in convincing?
So when you, of all different, plenty of people do research. A lot of the research we do is incremental, and you might make an observation then which seems to be, radical, which obviously bacteria living in the stomach previously unreported. So that was radical, if you like. And so that's what we got onto that. So the next thing would be if you find the underlying cause of something that nobody thought of, you can then make all kinds of hypotheses and tests to see if you're right. So for a good scientist, what you have to do is you have to be critical about your own data and try to prove yourself wrong. And so that, you read the literature and you say, well, one of them, how bad is pollution? Well, it's kind of good and bad, and you see a bit of smoke in the air, and everyone tells me that's causing cancer, and everyone's dying young, et cetera, et cetera. And I say, well, hang on a minute. I went to Japan And I visited Kobe in the 80s. It was very polluted. It was like one of these India, like Delhi, or one of these places like Los Angeles in the 60s. And yet at that time, Japanese had the longest lifespan in the world. They were already living till 90 years plus. So I say, okay, it might make a little bit of difference, and it doesn't make a big difference. So I thought it was a bit overrated. I still kind of do. So the other things are much more important than whether there's a bit of smoke around. So I'll probably get criticized for saying that. But anyway, so you can say, okay, well, that in my mind, that proved to me that pollution was not going to make you die at 50 rather than 70, because there's all those Japanese people having a good life.
Oh, I know.
Yeah. So things like that, you can find something that will disprove a hypothesis. So you think about the Helicobacter, okay, how could you disprove it? Well, one of the things you could do, you look at it and you say, as I said, it was practically impossible to find people with duodenal ulcers who did not have the bacteria. So that, that was an essential component of duodenal ulcers, to have the bacteria for some reason. So you could say, okay, well, that's one thing you could do. The next thing you can say, okay, what about, hey, there's some studies in the literature where people apparently cured ulcers. What did they use? Oh, bismuth. And so there were before cimetidine, there was the bismuth citrate had been used for 200 years, and people hadn't done proper trials on it. But there was a study that showed that in 50% of people who had their ulcer healed this way in South Africa, they'd never had a recurrence after that, and 50% did. So I say, well, the hypothesis would be that bismuth cures half of the bacterial infections. And I did a little bit of research on that, and sure enough, in some people the bacteria were permanently gone, other people they came back again. So and people in the US were buying Pepto-Bismol in the supermarket, and people who were like farm people, country people in Virginia, woodcutters, didn't know too much. They knew that when your stomach was playing up, you could go in and you could chug-a-lug a bottle of Pepto-Bismol over a day or two, which is a massive overdose according to the instructions, and you would be okay then for a few weeks or months. So this kind of anecdotal stuff came out.
So I don't know if you remember, a couple of years ago there was this thing called COVID-19 pandemic, and we don't necessarily have to go down this road, but there were people trying therapies, HCQ and then ivermectin and whatnot. And a lot of them got defamed and pilloried and ridiculed and censored and so forth. I don't have a pony in this race, whether it works or not, either one. I think if one works, it's probably more likely to be ivermectin than HCQ. But nonetheless, somebody did get the Nobel Prize as well for inventing ivermectin. And then it was kind of, called a horse dewormer and whatnot. It seems rather scientific. What do you think about kind of the off-label use of drugs, which seems to cross the board, and those, say kind of relative innocents who are, chugging bismuth, are they in effect doing science?
Yeah. Well, when if you have one patient, you might think about it. If you've got 10 of them that give you the same story, then it'd be worth looking into. So that's where they start. So regarding the different drugs that came out for Helicobacter, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. So hydroxychloroquine, I'm not sure what there might have been some observation about that in the beginning, in vitro work or whatever, but so often you see people do a bit of lab work in a test tube and then they extrapolate this straight to the human condition. There's no guarantee that it's going to work. So for instance, like, taking shark cartilage because you've got arthritis in your knees, just as a chemist, that's not going to make any difference. So the ivermectin one, it was kind of interesting because there was some in vitro data that has stopped the COVID sticking onto cells or something. I remember that it was done. So when there was nothing else, which is the first 8 months of the COVID-19 epidemic, why wouldn't you take it? Millions of people were already taking it, and there was all these people would say, well, we've got to, it's not proven and it's deadly dangerous. Same with hydroxychloroquine. You know, I treated people with arthritis for years and years with these long-acting drugs, and hydroxychloroquine, I think, was one of the things you could use. It had side effects, etc. But it wasn't like they were toxic chemicals. They were well-known drugs, and the problem was they were all generic. And so you didn't actually have a pharmaceutical company that was a sponsor to stick up for them. No one had any, as you said, the pony in that race. So I thought some of the comments were a bit unfair. I think I, would possibly take it if I had COVID at that time. So I didn't have any problem with that. But you would want to have some prospective double-blind studies, which eventually did happen. Everyone was doing them, and nothing made too much difference. And you had to have who was going to put in $100 million to test something like that was generic. Well, the answer was NIH.
We only have 5 minutes left. I've just seen the tag. So I want to make best use of your time. So my personal thing is overturning Zika. That's the name of my book. And that's kind of my mission of late. Zika, if you recall, is a dengue type virus. There are 4 dengues. They're called 1, 2, 3, and 4. And then Zika is apparently another dengue virus that never caused human illness. And then it was attributed in Brazil without ever causing a single human illness at all to be related to a totally kind of a different outbreak of potentially slightly more cases of microcephaly in Recife. And it's a long story. I'm not going to get into it now, but it was conjecture. There were none of the kind of rigorous studies of the Koch hypothesis, following through, so forth, that had been done at that time with that. Really, it came down to apparently the concluding piece of evidence was Dr. Carlos Brito in Recife, Brazil, calling post facto after calling 32 moms of who had babies with microcephaly in Recife and asking them if they had any fever, rash, and chills during pregnancy, because there were no Zika tests at the time. And then if anybody said yes, he said that was Zika. And then that was apparently leaked to the press. I don't know if it was by him, but presumably. And then they were off to the races with a panic and whatnot. I'm wondering, I guess, a couple of different questions. I've had a really hard time proving my or getting my book popularized in, published in New England Journal and so forth, even though Zika has not caused any microcephaly anywhere on Earth, anywhere, ever since, including Recife, Brazil in 2016, the very following year. And it totally disappeared, but everyone's like, oh, it's going to come back. It's kind of like where fact and medicine turns into religion or dogma and or research funding. I'm wondering, have you had any thoughts about, independently or spoken with people about why Zika microcephaly was a big thing? Obviously, it's been eclipsed by the most recent pandemic, but what happened to it? Does anyone talk about that in Australia?
Nobody would care too much about what happened in Brazil. There wasn't a lot of news coming out of Brazil, but it was right before the Olympic Games. So in that 6 months before, and all these young people were then going to go off to Brazil. So the idea of catching a virus there that caused microcephaly got a lot of press in the US. I think the proximity to the Olympic Games was one of the issues. So it reminds me of for years it used to annoy me so much that you weren't allowed to have anything switched on when you took a plane flight. And it was like, you weren't allowed to play a Nintendo, your Game Boy, and then, of course, pretty soon I had a computerized watch, and I used to look at it and think, my God, this is going to bring the plane down or something. So, and then the whole time, in fact, private planes were allowed. You could use your iPhone or whatever on a private plane. Nobody cared or made any difference. Martha Stewart was moving her shares around, selling her stock by making phone calls from her plane, I think. And then it gradually, one by one, it gradually fizzled out until now. I think you're not supposed to make phone calls when the plane is landing. So I'm kind of okay with that. But in fact, I know that my people in my family, I won't mention who, accidentally leaves their phone on in their handbag from time to time, because I can track them with track the iPhone, and I can see that it's just coming into land, things like that. It's picked up a signal. So anyway, so that was, if there's a safety issue, you don't have to prove it. That's the problem. And you can't prove that things are not there. There's always a chance that you didn't have a good method of testing for it or something. So it's a frustrating business. We're all doing things that make absolutely no difference.
Yeah, those negative signals can be evidence to the proper person. In my book, I quote Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle. There's the dog that didn't bark in the night. Are you familiar with that? So he solves one case. He says, but there's a notable incidence of the dog not barking. And the inspector's like, no, the dog didn't bark. That's not evidence. He says, well, it did not bark at the night, And anyway, the story goes that basically the fact the dog didn't bark means he must have known the intruder.
Oh, okay, of course.
The presence of an absence is also the absence of a, is a. I don't know how to say this correctly.
What does that say? The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Right. Thank you.
That's right. Yeah.
But so what we've seen since then is a nullity, a total absence of Zika being tracked. There's been no increase in microcephaly since people had better standards and better tests. Now they have Zika tests. Now they have a firm standard across the world for what is and is not microcephaly, including in Brazil, which had multiple standards, different times, and so on. And they haven't found any connection between the two. But that has not stopped anybody from getting research funding and still going about, proving something else. And it's kind of like the goalposts have moved. Anyway, so closing words of inspiration for the rest of us. And first of all, my plaudits and congratulations to you for sticking to your guns, as it were, and for carrying through and doing the experiment. And we didn't even get a chance to mention the fact that you took an ingestion of Helicobacter pylori yourself, and how brave and forthright that was, and the pain you went through, literal, to effectively birth this concept. I mean, very amazing and to be admired.
So there is a book called Who Goes First by Lawrence Altman. You have a look at it. It describes all the self-experiments in medicine over the years. And of course, you can talk about Walter Reed, and everybody's getting infected with yellow fever, and some of his research associates are dying from the experiment. So you don't want that to happen. So I was a bit lucky.
Pierre Curie. Well, actually, he got hit by a car, but Marie Curie had radiation poisoning.
Yeah. Well, I know
the same thing. The occupational hazard.
The Dr. Forsman in Denmark won the Nobel Prize for doing the first heart catheter, and he fed the catheter into his own arm and X-rayed his own heart with a catheter inside it. And everybody had said, you can never do that. Anything touches the heart, you're going to die instantly. So now we had cardiac surgery, cardiac catheterization because of that. So there's a few others that were a bit more dramatic than drinking Helicobacter.
Funny. Yeah, I don't have anything. I tend to challenge things. Like we had a corgi for a long time, and she used to swelter in the summer, so hot. She's a thick coat, and I always wanted to. I shaved my other dog. And I wanted to shave. Everyone's like, "Oh, you cannot shave a corgi. The hair's never going to grow in right." And I did that for a couple of years, and I read the internet and whatever. They're like, "Oh, you cannot do that." So after a while, I said, "You know what? Worst case scenario, she's going to have ugly hair, but she's going to be so much happier." So I would cut her hair down to a little tiny nap, and she was so happy all summer. And of course, the hair grew in fine. It's just hair, But people are really positive of this. And
well, just remember about dogs though. Never feed them chocolate. And so occasionally I'll give my dog an M&M. I mean, she lives for chocolate.
Yeah, no, that's the same thing. I figure that, and we've always been told, you cannot give the dogs chicken bones. And out in the wild, our dogs, when they see a dead bird or whatever, so one of them actually caught a semi-living bird, been hopping around. He had the bird and chopped. He ate the thing immediately. And the reason you can't theoretically is because they have spicules, because the bird bones, as opposed to cattle bones, the birds fly, so the bones are heavily, they're very heavily aerated, as it were. They're very thin, kind of micro architecture. And when you break one, they can be sharp. Okay, fine. But I figure, that's up to the dog. I mean, fortunately, he's not taking a proton pump inhibitor, and his stomach is going to break down that acid, and it has to get through the mouth, the esophagus. I get it. But, if he's going to do that once and hurt, and he's not going to do it again. And, he's going to it's like putting your finger in the socket. You do it once, put your hand on the oven once, and that's up to my dog. So I kind of leave it up to them. I leave it up to their own counsel. And they've we've been through a series of dogs, and each one has had a full life expectancy, duration, and longevity, and fine. there's just a lot of things that get said, and people just swear by them. But I don't know. I just
I don't know, but dogs are damn expensive these days.
No, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So maybe we could do, if you run out of material, we could do another one sometime in the future.
I love that. You're great.
That's very easy.
Really like to tap into your non-Helicobacter pylori font of knowledge and experience. I bet there's some great stories. So I'm at your service, and I really enjoyed this.
Okay. Well, great to hear from you, Randy, and good luck with your